If the history of the Ottoman Empire is a grand legend, then Şehzade Bayezid is its most poignant, unfinished chapter. The third son of Suleiman the Magnificent and Hürrem Sultan. Not the first heir, not his mother's favorite, not his father's chosen one. A man born into the gilded cage of a dynasty, where a brother could become either a sultan or a corpse. Today, millions know his name, but through the lens of TV series and romanticized legends. Handsome, passionate, a rebel. But history does not favor simple scripts. Behind the beautiful facade lies a far more complex, brutal, and politically motivated drama. This is not a story of a good prince and a bad sultan. It is a classic tragedy of power, where there are no righteous ones, only the victors and the dead. Bayezid is born in 1525, when the empire is at its peak, and his father has already spent a decade redrawing the map of the world. His childhood is Topkapı, a golden imprisonment, tutors, eunuchs, intrigues instead of toys. Beside him is his elder brother, Şehzade Mehmed, his mother's favorite and his father's hope, and another, Selim, whose figure would in time become fateful, and in neighboring chambers his elder half-brother, Mustafa, son of Mahidevran, a living reminder that the throne is guaranteed to no one. The chessboard is set, the pieces are in place. The first 20 years of his life are spent in the shadows, while Mustafa shines on the battlefronts and Mehmed receives the best senjaks. Bayezid waits. But in the Ottoman court, nothing is eternal. Fate abruptly reshuffles the deck in 1543. Mehmed, the potential heir to the throne, dies of smallpox, a shock for Suleiman and Hürrem. The main contenders for the throne are now three: Mustafa, Selim, and Bayezid. The pendulum has swung, and Bayezid, from a secondary character, suddenly becomes one of the leading actors in the struggle for the Ottoman throne.
He was sent to govern the Sanjak of Konya and later Amasya. This was the proving ground. Here the prince was to learn to rule, to judge, to command. And here, too, his image was forged, that of a resolute, generous, brave warrior. Historians note he was beloved by poets, adored by the janissaries, and respected by the people. He was charismatic, wrote poetry under the pen name Shah, and knew how to charm. But in politics, charisma is a double-edged sword, especially when your brother, Selim, while not brilliant, is a master of the long game, and your father, the Sultan, grows more suspicious with each year of anyone who becomes too popular. Today, we will dissect every myth. Was Bayezid an innocent victim of the intrigues of the cunning Selim and a heartless father? Was his popular love truly such a significant factor? And most importantly, what do the dry, often impartial pages of reports from Venetian ambassadors, Persian chroniclers, and Ottoman archives say about this, not TV series scripts? And so you don't miss other, no less fascinating Ottoman stories, click subscribe and the bell, because in our next videos we will delve into the empire's darkest archives. Within the walls of Topkapı, where every whisper could cost a throne or a life, in 1525 or 1526, a new infant's cry rang out, not just the cry of a baby, but a claim to future power: Şehzade Bayezid. The date of his birth was the first mystery of his biography. Ottoman chroniclers insisted on one date, Venetian spies reported another. This ambiguity is the perfect metaphor for his entire life, full of contradictions. He was not the first. By the time of his birth, the pieces of his elder brothers were already positioned on the dynastic chessboard. Mehmed, the brilliant favorite, his father's hope. Selim, the lover of wine and poetry, whose ambitions few took seriously at the time. And the main rival, one Bayezid did not choose, Şehzade Mustafa, son of the Cherkessian beauty Mahidevran. Mustafa was a folk hero, the epitome of an Ottoman prince. From childhood, Bayezid was destined to become his opposite, his shadow, and ultimately his fellow participant in the tragic elimination match.
The curator of this project named Bayezid was his mother, Hürrem Sultan, the woman who transformed the harem from a prison into her personal headquarters. She did not merely love her son, she invested in him. Every calligraphy lesson, every memorized poem, every swing of the training saber was a deposit into her dynastic fund. She found the best tutors and understood a prince must be not only a warrior, but also an intellectual. Bayezid became her passionate, temperamental pupil. And this temperament burst forth from his early years. Sources paint a picture of a boy whirlwind. At 5, he could effortlessly recite complex poetry, and at 7, in a fit of rage, he could snap an expensive bow across the back of a sluggish servant. He was impulsive, proud, and quick to take offense. His emotions, like a spring flood, swept away everything in their path. His elder brother, Selim, the future Sultan, already preferred the politics of hints and distancing. Bayezid, however, lived by the principle of all and at once. This quality was both admirable and frightening. In his edicts, Suleiman called him his lion cub, but a lion, as is known, is a dangerous and unpredictable animal. His true tempering began in Manisa. 13 or 14, the standard age for being sent to a province for apprenticeship. Manisa was a kind of throne simulator. Here, Bayezid first tasted the flavor of real, not ceremonial, power. He did not merely sit in the palace. He dispensed justice, inspected taxes, personally led punitive expeditions against rebellious Kizilbash tribes. He built mosques and fountains, leaving behind not only fear, but also gratitude. These years revealed his duality. He could be a just ruler, a generous patron, and an hour later, a merciless executioner, putting a talkative advisor to death. His court in Manisa was a micromodel of the future imperial household. Eunuchs, janissaries, poets, spies. They all reported everything, first to his mother in Istanbul, then to his father at the military headquarters. Bayezid grew up under a bell jar. Every victory and every mistake instantly became material for palace analysis. He was watched most closely by the people of Rustem Pasha, the Grand Vizier and husband of his sister, Mirhima. This alliance, Hürrem Rustem Mirhima, created a powerful faction in his support, but simultaneously hung a millstone of obligations around his neck. He was their stake in the great game. In between governing, he wrote poetry. He poured into it what could not be said openly: melancholy, rebellious thoughts, a thirst, a recognition. His poetry was passionate and dark, full of images of night, the dagger, and solitary battle. It was a vent for a man who had been prepared since childhood for one of two roles, padishah or a dead claimant. By the end of the 1540s, the project Şehzade Bayezid was ready for release. The result was a perfect yet flawed product of the Ottoman upbringing system, a brilliant military commander with a spark of poetic madness, a charismatic leader with ungovernable rage, a beloved son of his mother and a potential instrument in her hands. All the components of the future tragedy had been gathered and meticulously mixed in childhood. All that remained was to add the final ingredient, the abyss of paternal disappointment. His father, Suleiman, was a living legend. Europe trembled before the magnificent. Poets sang of Kanuni, the lawgiver. But in the private space of the palace, this colossus became an ordinary father, torn between affection and the ancient cruel law of the dynasty. The love for his sons in Suleiman's heart was engaged in a constant, exhausting dialogue with the cold voice of state necessity.
The figure of his mother, Hürrem, cast a long, manipulative shadow over Bayezid's life, from the slave girl Roxolana to the sole legal wife of the Sultan. This path she traversed not only with beauty, but with a steel intellect. For Bayezid, she was simultaneously a source of absolute protection and a source of constant pressure. Hürrem did not merely raise her son, she was programming a future sultan. Her web of influence enveloped the empire, from the kitchens of the harem to the offices of the grand viziers and the royal courts of Europe, with which she maintained personal correspondence. Bayezid was her project, a lion reared for the throne, as contemporaries noted. Yet within this maternal guardianship lurked a paradox. The more forcefully she advanced him, the fiercer the resistance from her opponents grew, and the more suspicious became the gaze of his father. Bayezid's brothers constituted his universe of rivalry. The eldest, Şehzade Mehmed, the first favorite, the empire's golden boy. His early death from smallpox was a family tragedy, but for Bayezid it was the first turn of fate, opening a path to the summit. Then came Selim, a full brother, son of the same Hürrem, seemingly a natural ally, but dynastic logic transformed blood kinship into a precondition for a future civil war. Selim, the future Sot, preferred jugs of wine to battlefields, which initially made him a less dangerous competitor in the eyes of the Janissaries, but a more convenient tool in the hands of court factions.
And looming on the horizon was the primary threat, Şehzade Mustafa, son of the disgraced Mahidevran, a handsome, talented commander, beloved by the army and the people. His popularity resounded through Istanbul like an alarm bell foretelling crisis. Mustafa was the embodiment of the Ottoman ideal of the warrior ruler, a living reproach to the sons of Hürrem. The death of Hürrem in 1558 became a point of no return for Bayezid. He lost his chief strategist, diplomat, and protector. The harem stood empty, the shield had vanished. The court, which during his mother's life had been a field of subtle maneuvers, transformed into a naked arena for the mortal struggle between the two remaining brothers, Bayezid and Selim. Suleiman, the aging, increasingly suspicious patriarch, watched this struggle, holding in one hand firmans of praise and in the other the silk cord for strangulation. Bayezid's position was akin to that of a brilliant but predetermined losing chess player. His strength was obvious to all, but the rules of the game had already been written not in his favor. The harem's poison, of which historians would later write, had already seeped into the very core of the dynasty, and Bayezid had no antidote left. But let us go back a little and look at the military successes of the Şehzade. The real test awaited Bayezid in his father's Persian campaigns. The year is 1548. The army of Suleiman, a giant steel organism, crawls towards Lake Van to avenge past defeats. Bayezid is no longer a provincial governor. He leads his own corps into battle, 10,000 elite janissaries and sipahi, his personal army. The campaign is a hell of mountain passes, winter frost, and the constant threat of betrayal by local tribes. It is here, beneath the walls of Van, that Bayezid proves his cruelty is not mere ferocity, but a tactical tool. He commands the right flank. When the Persians make a desperate sortie, he doesn't just repel the attack, he shatters it methodically, combining withering artillery fire with grueling night raids. This is not knightly valor, it is the work of war mechanic. The fortress falls. And then the climax. Suleiman the Magnificent, a living myth, rewards his son before everyone. A golden helmet, public praise, the title Lion of Anatolia. In this moment, Bayezid transforms from a prince of the blood into a folk hero. The soldiers see in him a younger copy of his father, that very Suleiman who had not yet become a suspicious padishah, but was an invincible warrior. The next act, the campaigns of 1552-1553.
Bayezid is 27 and given command of the army's core, the center core, the elite of the elite. Near Yerevan, he demonstrates what is valued in a commander even more than brilliant strategy: composure under fire. Persian cannons pound the assault columns, yet he reforms the ranks, finds a weak spot in the wall, and commits the reserves at the decisive moment. But his genius is not only in attack. After the triumphant capture of Tabriz, he is sent back to Kütahya. Now it is not a backwater, but a key stronghold. And here, Bayezid reveals his second face, that of an administrator. He cuts to the quick, reorganizing the system of timars, military fiefs. He reinforces garrisons, establishes logistics. When a Kizilbash rebellion erupts in Tokat, his response is swift and merciless: 200 executions. Cruel? Yes, but for the Anatolian Sipahis, who had been dying in these skirmishes for years, this was a language they understood. They began to see him as their own, a worthy heir. He was the physical embodiment of power, tall with a piercing gaze. On campaign, he refused heavy armor, preferring the mobility of light cavalry. He marched in the vanguard. This impulsive bravery had saved the day more than once, but within it lay a fatal flaw. He was accustomed to winning in battles where the rules were simple and the enemy obvious. The palace intrigues, where the enemy was invisible and the rules changed by the hour, demanded a different skill. And a shadow had already fallen across his path. His fame grew, but it was always weighed on the scales against another, against the popularity of his elder brother, Şehzade Mustafa. Every victory of Bayezid was not merely a victory for the empire, it was a move in a quiet yet deadly duel for their father's attention. He sought support not so much in the ranks of the army as in the corridors of power among the viziers and favorites. The strife between Bayezid and his half-brother Mustafa began as a quiet, almost invisible layer of ice, which grew thicker and more dreadful with each passing year. On one side stood Mustafa. Not merely the elder brother, he was a living legend of the mid-16th century. He did not simply rule from his sanjak, he was its face, its sword, and its shield. Tall, with a thick sultanic beard, he looked like a youthful copy of his father, Suleiman the Magnificent. Both the common people and the janissaries saw it, and they sang of it in the barracks and the bazaars. Mustafa is the padishah after the padishah. On the other side stands Bayezid, the son of Hürrem, a product not of the fields of battle, but of the gilded corridors of the harem and the divan. His sanjak was closer to the capital, richer, more comfortable, but it was the rear. Mustafa held the front, and in this disposition lay the first, fundamental dissonance. Mustafa embodied the old, martial Ottoman valor, Bayezid the new, almost Renaissance reality, where power was forged not only in the saddle, but in intrigues, letters, and whispers in the Sultan's ear.
Yet the true core of the conflict lay much deeper. It stemmed from the iron rule of the Ottoman Code. Only the strongest survives. After the death of their brother Mehmed in 1543, Mustafa, by tradition, was first in line to the throne. Bayezid, along with his brother Selim, came after. In such a system, to wait quietly for one's turn was a suicidal strategy. One had to either accept the role of an eternal second with a very short life expectancy after a brother's ascension, or to act. And here, an invisible but omnipotent third force entered the game, the harem. Their mother, Hürrem Sultan, and her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, looked upon the popular, charismatic Mustafa not as a future sovereign, but as an existential threat. He was adored by the janissaries, and the janissaries, for all their loyalty, were something of an armed council. If Mustafa dared to rebel, he had an army and the people's love. What did Bayezid have? A palace clique. Thus, the brothers' conflict quickly ceased to be their personal affair. It became a war where Bayezid was merely one flag on the map.
In her letters to Suleiman, who was constantly on campaign, Hürrem wove intricate meanings. She did not shout openly, "Kill Mustafa." She whispered, "My lion, the Janissaries already look to another lion. They forget whose hands feed them." She transformed Mustafa's strength, his martial glory, into his greatest vulnerability, into proof of potential treason. Bayezid, who perhaps initially did not seek a mortal clash, was gradually drawn into this game. In such a struggle, neutrality is not safety, it is self-removal. His own reports to his father began to take on a new, poisonous tone, no longer simply, "My brother is crossing boundaries," but "My brother is not executing your highest commands with due zeal." This was a language the court understood perfectly: insubordination. The culmination of this quiet phase came in the spring of 1553, the return from campaign, public audiences. Bayezid, skilled in rhetoric, praised the wisdom of his father, but in private, in conversations with viziers, his words about Mustafa grew barbs. Chroniclers paint an almost cinematic scene, both princes in the divan, exchanging glances in which everything can be read, from contempt to wary assessment. Each sees in the other both a brother and a potential murderer. And nearby, acting like an experienced director, is Rustem Pasha, fabricating the most convincing argument of the time, material evidence. Forged letters from Mustafa to the Persian Shah Tahmasp I. In them, promises, alliances, plans against the old Sultan.
Bayezid did not pull the strings of this conspiracy. Rather, he became its silent witness. He saw which way the wind was blowing from his mother's chambers and the office of the Grand Vizier, and he did not build a dam. His consent was passive, but in the realities of the Ottoman court, this was complicity. He allowed the shadow of his rival brother to grow so long that it became threatening to Suleiman himself. And when a shadow grows too long and dark, there is only one remedy for it: the noonday sun of the Padishah's wrath, which is precisely what happened in the tent near Ereğli in October 1553. And here lies the main paradox and tragedy of Bayezid. The execution of Mustafa, which he may have secretly desired as the removal of his main rival, became for him not a victory, but the beginning of the end. By removing the lion, Mustafa, he himself inadvertently took his place in the suspicious mind of his aging father. From a secondary predator, he transformed into the primary threat. The shadow they had dispensed with immediately reformed to envelop him. The feud with Mustafa was not the start of his path to the throne, but the first act of his own downfall. He won the battle, but the landscape after that victory became so mined that the next step was almost guaranteed to be fatal. Winter 1559. The palace walls in Istanbul are not merely cold, they are saturated with a silent tension. In Konya, in his sanjak, Şehzade Selim methodically drafts letters to his father. His ink is poison and his pen a dagger. Each missive to Sultan Suleiman is a meticulous denunciation. His brother Bayezid is arming himself, gathering men, amassing power. Selim, a man of sober calculation, makes a forecast. He will not strike in winter, he will strike in spring. And he adds the most crucial detail. The younger brother is beloved in the capital. His supporters are not just the rabble, but influential men in high turbans. This is no longer a family dispute, but a threat to the state. Suleiman, who in his time witnessed the conspiracy of his own father, hears a dreadful echo in these words. His reply to Selim is a command for defense, to remain in Konya, to fortify.
And Selim, having received his father's blessing, does what always defeats high ideals. He pays his soldiers generously. Gold fills the pockets of those who must hold the line against a potential fraternal assault.
Simultaneously, the Sultan sends a letter to Bayezid as well. The text is a masterpiece of Ottoman diplomacy, where every word is an insinuation, and between the lines lies an abyss. "No cruelty has been shown to you," writes Suleiman. "This is not consolation, it is a reminder of paternal authority." But Bayezid reads these lines and sees in them only hypocrisy. He remembers the fate of Mustafa, the beloved elder brother, strangled in their father's tent due to slander. Now he is certain Selim is weaving the same web of calumny, and fear mixed with resentment drives him to a fatal step. Instead of lying low and waiting, he leaves his fortress in Amasya in mid-April. The silence of winter anticipation explodes with the rumble of the departing cortege. His first destination is Ankara, a geographical and strategic move, a city equidistant from the wrath of Istanbul and from Selim's army in Konya. From here he writes to his father again, demanding the return of the rich sanjak of Kütahya, taken from him after Mustafa's death. But this is already a formality. A plan has ripened in his mind, swift and brutal, to crush Selim with a single blow before his father comes to his senses, to kill his only remaining brother and become the heir without alternative. He believes in speed and surprise. He had miscalculated. News of his movement reached the divan faster than his army could traverse the Anatolian roads, and then the empire's slow-moving machinery lurched into motion with terrifying efficiency. Suleiman issued an order to the third vizier, the ambitious Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, to march the Janissaries to join Selim. They were reinforced by Rumelian troops under the command of Mustafa Pasha. This was not merely a reinforcement, it was the iron will of the Sultan made manifest. The empire had made its choice. But Suleiman struck not only with the sword, he also struck with the word, sacred and incontestable. Against his own son, he marshaled the theologians. Sheikh-ul-Islam Ebu Suud Effendi, the legal genius who had codified the empire's laws, now codified the verdict for the Shehzade. A fatwa was born. Bayezid was no longer a son or a prince, he was a rebel who had defied the legitimate ruler, a plunderer and troublemaker. His life could now be taken without sin. This scroll was terrible than 40 cannons. Learning of both the troops and the fatwa, Bayezid understood. There was no turning back. Now, in the coming battle with his brother, only one could survive.
By the end of May, his 30,000-strong army reached the walls of Konya. The disposition of forces spoke volumes. Selim was behind stone fortifications, his army composed of regular units led by pashas and governors. Bayezid's army was a surge of passion, hastily assembled from loyal Timariots and volunteers who believed in his righteous cause. On May 30th, 1559, the battle that was never meant to be began. Bayezid's troops fought with the fury of the doomed, with the conviction of those defending justice. They surged forward, but Selim's army, better armed, more numerous and disciplined, did not so much attack as methodically repel the assaults. The outcome was decided not by bravery, but by logistics and the imperial treasury. Within 2 days, it was over. The rebels' losses were enormous. Bayezid, saving the remnants of his army, retreated in panic to Amasya. And here a metamorphosis occurs, one fatal to any rebel. Rage gives way to panic, confidence to supplication.
He sends the mufti to his father with contrition. He writes abject letters to the all-powerful Rustem Pasha, begging for intercession. He tries to play a double game, repenting while once more gathering troops. This duplicity becomes the final nail in his coffin. For Suleiman, the pleas appear not as repentance, but as weakness and deceit. The order is brief: seize him. Bayezid realizes Amasya is a trap. On July 7th, the day of Eid al-Fitr, the Holy Friday after Ramadan, when the entire faithful army should be at prayer, not in pursuit, he makes his second strategic blunder. He flees. With his 4 young sons and loyal thousands, he gallops east toward the Persian border, counting on speed. He writes to his sister Mirhima, his last hope, imploring her to influence their father.
But politics is a machine harder to stop than to start. As Bayezid races through Bayburt toward Erzurum, he is overtaken by Selim's advance units. The skirmish at Çukur Sad is the final battle on his native soil. Fighting them off, he understands completely. There is no longer a place for him in the Ottoman Empire. In mid-August 1559, Şehzade Bayezid, son of the Lord of the Age, crosses the border and seeks asylum from the sworn enemy, Shah Tahmasp of Persia. In the moment his horse's hooves touch foreign soil, the fatwa gains an inexorable force. He is not merely a fugitive, he is an exile who has delivered himself into the hands of the enemy. His fate ceases to be a family drama and becomes a matter of state prestige. The rebellion was over. The long haggling over the price of his head had begun. Shah Tahmasp received Bayezid not as a fugitive, but as a trump card in a grand game. He threw a feast, lavish to the point of indecency, robes of honor, gifts worth 10,000 tumans. The Persian treasury did not hold back. There was calculation in this. Bayezid and his retinue of 12,000 swords were housed almost as guests of honor, his men distributed among border garrisons for the winter. It seemed the Shah had acquired a living, breathing, diplomatic bomb. Bayezid himself, by all appearances, believed in this performance. In a letter to his father, he called Tahmasp a second father, a gesture of desperation that in Istanbul was seen as the highest form of betrayal. But the Shah's hospitality was as deceptive as a desert mirage. He had no intention of fighting Suleiman for the honor of a prince. Instead, Tahmasp did what any pragmatist does in a difficult position. He began to bargain. He hinted to Istanbul that it would be nice to hand over to Bayezid, say Erzurum or Baghdad, strategic gateways that would immediately become Persian. It was elegant blackmail. However, Suleiman knew his son's weakness. The army which adored the martyr Mustafa despised Bayezid the turncoat. A war on 2 fronts did not threaten the Sultan. The tension mounted. Tahmasp, a master of intrigue, staged a feast to reassure his guest. Instead of refreshments, a trap. As soon as Bayezid crossed the threshold with his sons and loyal commanders, all were seized. In an instant, the valuable hostage Bayezid turned into a powerless prisoner in a torn robe and with a shaven beard, a visible symbol of his downfall.
The bargaining began, cynical and merciless. An exchange of letters worthy of a thriller unfolded. Suleiman, the father, pleaded for his son to be returned home, offering mountains of gold. His tone, as historians note, betrayed the last flicker of hope to save the rebel's life. But he was up against a tandem, Shah Tahmasp, who wanted to extract the maximum, and the heir, Selim, who saw his brother as the only threat. Selim conducted separate, harsh negotiations, openly discussing the terms of execution. In the end, the price was set: 1,200,000 gold coins and the key fortress of Kars. And also, more important than money, a sworn pledge from Selim of eternal friendship with Persia for when he became Sultan.
An Ottoman delegation with untold gifts, Arabian steeds in golden harnesses, swords studded with Badakhshan rubies, chests of fabrics and coins, arrived in Qazvin in July 1562. Having received his advance payment, the Shah gave the order for the handover. There was no ceremony. According to one account, Bayezid was brought before the envoys in his wretched garments. They coldly asked, "If you are who you claim to be, then a death sentence has been passed upon you." After a formal identification at the Qazvin parade ground, the sentence was carried out. The method chosen was noble, without shedding blood. First, the Shehzade himself was strangled, then, one after another, his 5 sons. The youngest, a 3-year-old, met the same fate in Bursa. The dynastic principle worked without fail. The bodies, embalmed with musk, were taken toward the Ottoman Empire, but Istanbul refused to receive them. An order came from Suleiman: bury them outside Sivas, by the road. Not in the capital's mausoleum, but in an unmarked piece of land, away from sight. Shah Tahmasp never received all the promised gold and cars, but he gained something greater: peace on his eastern border for decades to come. And the Ottoman dynasty learned the final lesson of fraternal war. Henceforth, the throne would pass not to the best, but to the eldest. The mechanism became soulless, yet predictable. The irony of fate was that at the moment of Bayezid's execution, everyone lost. The Shehzade himself, his life; his father, a son and a daughter. Mehrima donned mourning and forever distanced herself from her father. And the empire, possibly the last energetic heir capable of continuing the era of conquest. The only victor was cold calculation. Bayezid's death left a void in the Ottoman house that proved impossible to fill. This was not merely the loss of a prince, it was the collapse of a certain type of power. Bayezid was the last of the old school, a warrior, a poet, a charismatic leader whose authority was born in the saddle, not in the treacherous corridors of Topkapı. His elimination became a point of no return. After 1561, the dynasty definitively transitioned from the era of conquerors to the era of administrators, and then to the era of puppets in silk robes.
Selim II, upon ascending the throne, did not merely live up to his epithet, the Sot. He became the embodiment of a systemic shift. The state that his father had ruled from a campaign tent was now governed from the divan, often over the Sultan's head. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was not just a military defeat, it was a symbolic slap in the face of the empire, showing that the Ottoman lion could stumble. The corruption held in check by Suleiman's iron will flourished under Selim in full bloom. The Grand Vizier, Mehmed Sokolu, still held the empire's framework together, but its foundations had been undermined. The dynasty had lost not just an heir, it had lost that very warrior spirit that had driven its armies to the walls of Vienna. And what of the family? Hürrem Sultan, who died 3 years before her son's execution, won in a twisted sense. Her blood, through Selim and her grandchildren, flowed in the veins of future sultans. But this victory was Pyrrhic. The engine of intrigue she and Rustem Pasha set in motion spiraled out of control. It became the hereditary disease of the Ottomans. The kafes system, the gilded cage for Shehzades, transformed from a precautionary measure into an incubator of neuroses and weak-willed rulers. Bayezid was one of the last to fight for the throne with a sword in his hand. After him, the struggle boiled down to the silent strangulation of rivals with silk cords in the depths of the harem. The era of the Sultanate of Women began, where real power passed to the Valid Sultan and the Haseki, while the Padishah became a pawn on a chessboard moved by others.
In the people's memory, Bayezid instantly became a tragic martyr.
In Anatolian coffee houses, ballads were sung of how the lion of Anatolia fell not by an honest saber, but by the poison of a treacherous brother. He was compared to Şehzade Mustafa, another victim of palace vipers. This popular cult was a form of quiet protest. The janissaries and commoners nostalgically longed for a real prince, a warrior, in contrast to Selim. The myth grew, acquiring wild details, that Selim personally handed his brother a poisoned cup, that Bayezid cursed the entire dynasty with his dying breath. Persian chroniclers created their own myth of a noble ally, almost a martyr for the Shia faith. They tactfully forgot that Bayezid was a Sunni who viewed the Safavids merely as temporary refuge in his bid for the throne. Modern TV series like Magnificent Century completed the transformation of the historical figure into a romantic idol. Bayezid became an impulsive, handsome man, a victim of passion and family intrigue. Reality, as always, is more complex and ruthless than myth. Bayezid was not a perfect knight. He was brave to the point of recklessness, talented as a commander, and refined as a poet. But he was a terrible diplomat and politician. His rebellion of 1559 was a reckless, poorly calculated gamble. He lost not because he was worse, but because Selim and his advisers played dirtier and smarter. In this familial slaughter, it was not the worthiest who survived, but the one best adapted to the poisonous atmosphere of the palace. The outcome is cruel and simple. The execution of Bayezid became the point after which the dynasty's vector shifted from external expansion to internal self-consumption. The wounds inflicted in this fratricidal clash never fully healed. They festered, weakening the state from within. The Ottoman Empire continued to awe the world with its grandeur for another 2.5 centuries, but it was already the inertia of a falling giant. The spirit embodied in men like Bayezid, warlike, ambitious, reckless, was methodically purged from the dynasty. All that remained was a gilded shell, within which the pages of denunciations rustled softly and conspirators whispered. His death is not a drama about one man. It is a parable of how an empire begins to devour its best children, only to end up in proud yet fatal solitude.